The world of indie games is an interesting one. There are so many developers out there trying to make a name for themselves either by coming up with brand new ideas or putting a fresh spin on something familiar. Because of that, there's an overwhelming number of indie games that never really see the light of day, but every now and then you stumble across a real gem. Whether it's an idea no one's tried before or just a new perspective on an old genre, indie games are often where you find the most creative and innovative stuff in the industry, and Core Keeper is exactly that. A familiar survival sandbox with just enough unique ideas to make it stand out from the crowd. Developed by Pugstorm, Core Keeper lets you and up to 8 players explore an underground world that once was home to a thriving civilization. You start the game waking up beside a strange being known as the Core. It gives you glimpses into what happened in this ancient world and tasks you with defeating a number of powerful bosses scattered across a massive procedurally generated map. Beyond that, the game lets you loose. You'll build, farm, fish, mine, and loot to your heart's content while upgrading your gear, uncovering ancient ruins, and tracking down gigantic monsters. At first glance, Core Keeper follows a pretty standard formula when it comes to survival and crafting. You'll pick a place to call home and start expanding it, building farms, workshops, forges, and whatever else your imagination can come up with. This base becomes your main hub where you'll cook food, fine-tune your gear, and prepare for your next big expedition. And while a lot of it might feel familiar if you've played games like this before, Core Keeper does introduce some fresh elements. But let's begin with the more familiar aspects of the game. Core Keeper features a more linear crafting progression system. You start with a basic workbench that only has a few recipes for tools, equipment, structures, and so on. To unlock more, you'll need to upgrade the workbench using higher tier materials. Each new tier opens up more crafting options, which naturally encourages you to explore deeper into the underground world. The only downside is that later on, the number of new recipes per tier of workbench drops off pretty hard. Eventually, you'll find yourself building more for cosmetic reasons than for actual functionality, and if you're like me when it comes to survival games, I like each room or structure to serve a purpose, not just look nice. Add to that the limitations of a 2D layout and your creativity can feel a little boxed in. That said, if you're into decorating, Core Keeper might be one of the best in the genre. This game has a ridiculous number of decorative items, more than I've seen in almost any other survival crafting game. And it's not just stuff you can craft. A lot of it is scattered around the world ready to be discovered. Even better, many of these items have different visual variants that you can cycle through using the paintbrush tool. It gives you a lot of freedom to add fine details to your builds, and if you get tired of decorating, well, you can always grab an ocarina and jam out with your friends. Yes, you can actually learn to play songs together. Zelda's Lullaby, anybody? I also want to call out how streamlined Core Keeper's survival mechanics are. While that might take away from the hardcore survival feel, I actually found it to be quite refreshing. The only survival mechanic that you need to worry about outside of getting killed by monsters is your hunger. But once you acquire a reliable source of food, you're pretty much good to go. You also don't need to carry materials in your inventory to craft. As long as the materials are in a nearby chest, you'll be able to craft whatever you want. Stack sizes seem to be unlimited, so you won't end up with 18,000 chests full of dirt, and you can dump your entire inventory into nearby chests with the press of a button. It's small stuff, but it really adds up. There's also no day-night cycle, no weather, or really anything that might hinder you achieving your goals. You just play at your own pace, and I love that. But building and decorating is really just the surface of Core Keeper. Where it really stands out is in its exploration and combat. The world itself is huge, and every time you venture out, you're likely to stumble onto something new. Whether it's a hidden dungeon, some buried treasure, or a towering boss fight, there's always something interesting to go do. The main goal is to find and defeat the bosses scattered throughout the world, piecing together what exactly happened in this lost civilization. And the combat along the way is surprisingly solid. It's simple, sure, but it's more engaging than I expected, especially the boss fights. Each one brings unique mechanics to the table, often forcing you to stay on the move, dodging lightning bolts, clearing waves of minions, or reshaping the terrain mid-fight to gain an advantage. It's actually more complex and rewarding than a lot of combat systems I've seen in big-budget top-down dungeon crawlers. Character progression within Core Keeper is also quite unique for the genre and complements the dungeon crawling aspect quite nicely. In most survival games I've played, your strength is almost entirely gear-based. That's still true to some degree here, but Core Keeper adds a nice layer of RPG-style skill progression. There are 12 different skills, things like gardening, fishing, melee combat, and magic, and each one levels up as you use it. Every 5 levels, you earn a point to spend on perks that shape your playstyle. Pair that with gear that offers stat bonuses, and you've got yourself a surprisingly solid class-based system. Even the more domestic skill trees like cooking can play a large part in this RPG element. In our playthrough, Tristan leaned into this necromancer build that summoned minions, I went with a crit-based archer, and Terrell was our personal chef, creating meals that provided temporary combat bonuses. That said, some builds are definitely more fleshed out than others. Magic builds in particular seem to have way more gear options than anything else. Meanwhile, some combat styles only have 1 or 2 armor sets that actually support them. I do want to take a second to talk about the difficulty of Core Keeper. We generally play just about everything on the hardest difficulty, and that's the way we like it. But I wouldn't recommend doing it for Core Keeper. The challenge presented by the hard difficulty is pretty fair, but then scales to be even harder with each new player that joins the game. The result was just us getting one-shot by basically everything, and it got old real fast, especially when you have to make the long trek back to your body just to get your gear again. This also causes some imbalances between builds. On hard mode, melee builds especially feel kind of broken, and not in a good way. Enemies just hit way too hard for close range combat to be viable in a lot of cases. Really, the only viable builds on hard mode are ranged, and even then it can be frustrating. Visually, Core Keeper is gorgeous. Pixel art always has its own charm, but this game takes it to another level. From crops and crafting stations to enemies and terrain blocks, everything has a lot of care and detail put into it. The ambient details really bring the world to life, like little critters scurrying in the background, shimmering reflections in the water, and subtle movement in the environment. But the real star of the show is the lighting. The lighting in Core Keeper is some of the best I've seen in a pixelated game. Torches flicker realistically, casting dynamic shadows based on the objects around them. Natural light pours in through cracks in the ceiling or open spaces, and you can use light both aesthetically and mechanically as you explore. It's genuinely beautiful, and it adds so much atmosphere to the underground world. And the good news is, the game's still growing. Core Keeper seems to have a dedicated team behind it, and they've already rolled out several updates since we started playing. One of them was especially big, adding new biomes, dungeons, gear, bosses, and more. If the developers keep up this pace, it could easily become one of those games you and your friends return to over and over again. At first glance, Core Keeper looks like your typical survival sandbox. Pick a spot, build a base, explore a mysterious world. But look a little deeper and it's clear the game is doing something more. With RPG-style builds, skill trees, and rewarding exploration, Core Keeper adds just enough depth to carve out its own niche. Sure, it sometimes feels like it spreads itself a bit thin, touching on a lot of mechanics without fully perfecting any one of them, but if you're looking for a fresh survival experience to play with friends, this one's absolutely worth checking out. Thank you everybody for watching. If you liked what you saw, be sure to like and subscribe and follow us on Twitch for live content. Until next time, cheers!